Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. President Bush and his supporters say that the war in Iraq is going better, that the troop surge is working, and that there is real promise. Detractors disagree. They say that this war is costing us way too much blood and way too much treasure, that the war seems endless. With me today to discuss the war in Iraq is Colonel Don Askew, an occasional guest on the program. Colonel Askew is retired from the United States Army, Special Forces, decorated combat veteran of Vietnam, has spent a good deal of time in the Middle East. He was an advisor to President Carter and President Reagan on this subject, and also was in the Pentagon and helped plan the Gulf War of '91. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Barry. It's nice to be here.
You warned me not to describe you as an authority or an expert, and you were on campus a few days ago and you told our students that if someone comes to you and says, I'm an expert on the Middle East, that the student was to run away. So you stand by those words?
I stand by those words. It's far too complicated a subject and way too many complex dynamics for any one person to say, I'm an expert. That implies I know everything there is to know and you don't. And experts, it's been defined earlier as some guy from out of town with a suitcase. So no, don't call me an expert. I've been there and done that, but a long way from being an expert.
Well, let's put it this way. Based on your experience in dealing with this part of the world, how do you assess the conflict in Iraq as of today?
Well, assessing it in what capacity? I mean,
is it, well, as the president says, are we doing better, or as his detractors say, this is a quagmire?
It depends a lot on what your criteria and what your objectives are. There are some instances in which conflict has ceased, at least for the moment.
Anbar, for example.
Anbar, but we don't want to forget that the reason that Anbar has calmed down was an initiative taken by both the Sunni and the Shia leaders to basically join forces against the Taliban and kind of work with us as the lesser of two evils. And this started long before the surge.
Now, if I may stop you right there. You don't know the players without a program.
Mm-hmm.
Explain to the viewers again, what is the difference between a Sunni and a Shia?
It has to do with the religion, of course, and the difference essentially is in who became the leaders of the Islamic Party following the death of Muhammad. One group believed that it should have been the senior caliphs. The others believe that the direct lineage should have come down through Muhammad and Muhammad's family on down to his cousin, and that's where the difference lies. Over the years, they have become factional and to the point of dividing the religion. It's just much like any other kind of religious conflict between two branches of
Catholics
same church.
And Protestant before we went on there in Northern Ireland.
Right. It's much a similar situation. It has to do with a difference in belief following the death of Muhammad as to who the new leadership should fall to.
Now, the majority in the Muslim world is Sunni.
Mm-hmm.
What about in Iraq?
In Iraq, I don't really know which is. I think they're fairly well split, but I believe the Sunni have an edge both in terms of power and in terms of population.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe you do find, but the Shia tend to be much more aggressive, and so sometimes in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man, and so forth and so on. So I think they have a significant edge in aggressiveness, and the underdog always seems to work a little harder.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. Going back to the history of this conflict, had you been the President of the United States, would you have gone into Iraq, or at least the way we did?
No.
Why not?
Well, in the first place, there's no doubt in anybody's mind who is familiar with that part of the world that Saddam Hussein was a very, very bad man.
Absolutely.
The world is certainly better off without Saddam Hussein
Absolutely.
in a position of leadership in it. The country of Iraq the people of Iraq are certainly better off without this guy in power. However, when it comes to the employment of U.S. military forces and resources, you want to kind of do that only in issues that impact on our national security or national strategy or our national goals and self-interests. And to be absolutely honest, the justification for going into Iraq, in my view, was a little on the shaky side. The question was, well, they were tied in with 9/11. Well, virtually no way that they could have been tied in with 9/11.
Now, why is that? Because a lot of Americans believe that.
Oh, okay. For one reason, there was absolutely no connection between any of the conspirators that anyone knew about tying them to Iraq, either directly or indirectly. But the big reason, of course, is that Saddam Hussein is the proverbial loose cannon. He is a man who lived in a fantasy world of his own. He's a classic card-carrying despotic dictator. You know, he's kind of like Idi Amin. His focus was internal. He wanted to keep himself going. He wanted to play like he was much more powerful, much more influential. You know, that Allah had given him this great mission of restoring the Babylonian Empire to its former greatness. You know, he kind of lived in this little fantasy world. Osama bin Laden, on the other hand, who is a very cool, calculating, meticulous planner. This guy could be a very successful strategist in anybody's culture, in anybody's military. He is a planner in depth. He plans in great detail. He's the very last thing that the two personalities would ever do is join. Saddam Hussein is the loose cannon. Osama bin Laden abhors loose cannons. So the two would never come together, ever, under any circumstances that I can conceive of, and others who share same level or degree of experience feel the same.
And wasn't Saddam also a secular ruler? He was more in the line of Stalin, wasn't he, rather than?
Well, yeah, he certainly was. You know, he claimed to be a devout and religious Muslim and following the Muslim Islamic religion and so forth and so on. But his actions did not bear out his statement of faith. He was, you go back into his history, he was actually a simple little street thug that was actually abandoned by his own parents. As a small child, he was raised by his grandmother. He was a street thug that used his ability to manipulate people and his knowledge of brute force and his just innate smarts, street smarts, to rise to power in the Ba'ath Party. Mm-hmm. And he actually had only been out of the country once, and he went to England for 2 years, for 2 weeks after he became the head of the Ba'ath Party. Didn't like it and returned, and as far as anyone knows, never really left the country again. You know, he just was not an educated man at all, and certainly not a tie with Islam. And that's one thing that bothers me, is the ties with Islam. You know, the very last thing in the world we need in this world is more people spreading hate. And what you see in awful times is a tie from 9/11 tie to Saddam Hussein, to Iraq, to Islam. And I've stated before that a good similarity or a good analogy is the type of thing that we used to do in school when we had the little quizzes that said, you know, glove is to hand as watt is to foot, you know, and we did that kind of logic. Well, I will look at it this way. In my view, Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda are to Islam as the Ku Klux Klan would be to Christianity. I mean, it's just not the same. But you have a classic example, and it's been done in history before, of individual wanting power and wanting influence, taking religion and using it as a tool to manipulate innocent people into doing what they think is the right thing and the will of God to do. And it's pretty tricky. But on the other hand, that's the nice thing about terrorism. You know, its sole purpose is to be tricky. But I don't know if I've answered your question or not,
No, that's
but
good.
the other justification for going into Iraq was, well, he has weapons of mass destruction. You know, he's going to deploy these massive weapons, and we're going to all be in trouble. Well, you know, if you look at weapons of mass destruction, you consider that to be chemical, biological, and radiological weapons. Well, we know he had chemical weapons because he used them on his own people during his conflicts with both the Kurds and with the Iranians much earlier. Biological weapons are no big deal. You know, you and I can take a cup full of milk and leave you sitting out on an open place and wind up with a biological weapon. You know, it's not hard to do that. So did he have them? I don't know. Probably most would-be dictators do have. Did he have a nuclear program? I expect he probably did. But on the other hand, that's no big deal either. The first place, a nuclear weapon or any other kind of weapon is only as good as the means to deploy it. So, you know, you can have all of them you want. If you can't get them out of your backyard, you really don't care. On the other hand, his ability to put them together is not as insignificant as his ability to acquire them. So if you and I and 3 other guys can raise enough money, we can become a nuclear power ourselves. I mean, there's plenty of people who will sell you a working nuclear weapon. So, you know, having a nuclear program and access to nuclear weapons is not a big deal. There's an awful lot of sources for nuclear weapons in the world that are easily accessed by anyone who has the money. So those don't really hold much water either. So you have to wonder, or at least I have to wonder, what the motivation was.
What do you think the motivation was?
I don't know. I don't really know what the motivation was. You can play what-if scenarios all you want to, all the way from, well, did we just want to finish the job we started with Desert Storm? Or was there some other means that most of us are not privy to knowing that motivated this? Or was there just an honest reaction to wanting to do something to respond to 9/11? And unfortunately, we responded maybe the wrong way. When you stop and consider that we're stuck up to our elbows in a civil war, essentially, and in a country that really didn't invite us in. We were not invited in, we went in. And that makes it a little different in terms of getting out. Also, the idea that, I guess, that we needed to be there, we needed to go into Iraq and finish this job, kind of took away a little bit from the actual problem of finding and doing away with Osama bin Laden and his gang. And we went into Afghanistan because bin Laden had a group there that was Al-Qaeda, was being supported by the Taliban. It was a safe haven. He was operating in and out of there. And we went into Afghanistan to get rid of that, and in fact did. I mean, we dealt him a serious blow in terms of his ability to train and to run command and control operations out of Afghanistan as a safe haven. Maybe we felt at the time, the powers that be felt, that it was time for us to do the same thing in Iraq. I don't know. You can speculate this for a long time. Obviously, you hear the other conspiracy theories about well, it was an oil-driven thing, or it was a personal thing between the Bushes. I don't know. I find those a little hard to believe. I think sometimes we just jump in with both feet and don't really bother to think all the way through what we're doing.
Do you see any parallels between Iraq and Vietnam? And people make comparisons all the time about that. Are they valid?
No, I don't think so, really. I think it's two totally different things, two totally different scenarios. It's a totally different world between the time that Vietnam was running wild in the 60s and 70s to where we are today. You know, war doesn't go away. The war just changes its face to meet the circumstances. We tend to be in this country a non-military. We're not a militant group of people. The use of military force has never been a big thing in our society. As a result, we only, in the past, have used it when we felt it was necessary and in our national interest. So we always continually train for the last war, not the next one. And as a result, we fight our wars one war too late until we learn. Then we begin to get smart and say, oh, this is different. We got to do this one differently. World War I was different from World War II. When World War II started and we got involved in it, we initially thought that we were going to have to fight World War I again with a trench warfare and a war of attrition. And the Germans blew us away with Blitzkrieg, their fast-moving war. We didn't know how to react to that. It took us a while to learn. We learned well. And then along came Korea, which was a different situation politically. Mm-hmm. Militarily, the tactics were pretty much the same. We were still fighting positional chess piece war, but the politics of the whole thing were totally different. Same way in Vietnam. We fought in Vietnam initially like we were back in World War II in the jungles. Mm-hmm. And, we didn't understand for a long time that we were fighting an ideological war, not a political war, and not a war of accession. We were fighting an idea, and we adjusted to that. So, and this is totally different too. After Desert Storm, for example, we got a lot of flack because we were involved in Kosovo, and everybody thought, well, you did so well in Desert Storm.
Why mess it up?
Why mess it up, So then we went to Somalia and got our backsides kicked by a bunch of yahoos running around the desert with homemade weapons stuck on the back of Nissan pickup trucks. Again, because we went in with a mindset, a tactic, and a training mode that was just a little bit late. We just need to think a little bit more. Having gone through the planning for Desert Storm, I know what we did when we put that one together, and as a result...
Didn't you tell me that you even read the campaigns of Alexander the Great in doing that far
we
back?
used as the historical references for...
That's deep background.
Well, we didn't use Alexander the Great, actually. We used three references, historical references, when we built the strategy for Desert Storm, what turned into Desert Storm. We used the books of the Old Testament. We used the works of Flavius Josephus,
right,
who was a historian who lived, as you know, at the time of Christ, and wrote a rather large book called The Antiquities of the Jews, in which he laid out their history and obviously all the battles. And we used Caesar's commentaries.
That's still deep background.
Yeah, pretty deep. But, history repeats itself, and hey, if you can learn from somebody else, let's take advantage of that. And that's basically what we did. And I know what we did in terms of developing entrance strategies and exit strategies, and I just didn't see any of that. Sitting on the periphery of this one, I didn't see any indication that any of that had been done. It may have been. I just didn't see it. I wish it had. I think we would have had a little different situation here.
Now that we're there, if you could be the President of the United States tomorrow, what would you do?
I would be promoted. But no, actually, I right now, knowing what I know, now keep in mind that there's always a possibility that there's factors out there and issues and situations that we don't know about, and knowing about them might change your advice. Mm-hmm. But based on what I know right now, I would say we need to get out of there as much as we can. And we cannot really go completely away and go home. It's just totally unfeasible. If we did that, first of all, we have a moral obligation to the Iraqi people. In essence, we caused the problem. There's an old rule in political military worlds that says a ruler can rule, but only with the consent of those who he rules. Okay, in other words, if you get fed up, if the people get fed up enough, then they're going to do something about it. They're going to take away, or they're going to seek help, but they're going to take some action, and eventually get rid of it. Case example, in the American Revolution. You can look at any others. A bunch of good guys just got ticked off and fed up, and they did something about it. Well, that rule has existed down through the annals of time. And if the Iraqi people had wanted Saddam Hussein to be deposed, they could have done something about it themselves. They didn't do it. They didn't invite us in. We did not get a message that said, would you guys please come help us here? We went in for our own reasons, whatever those reasons might be in reality. We went in there for those reasons. And so therefore we have a moral obligation to not leave them hung out to dry and just walk away from it, because the Civil War aspect of this thing will go right back again. And you've got to leave some degree of stability. You got to do something for the Iraqi people to at least give them a halfway decent chance. We did in World War II. We not only defeated one enemy and held the other one in place until we did, then we turned around and defeated that enemy with a technology that the world had never seen before. And then we turned around and rebuilt both of them and made them into allies. This is, we're going to have to do something like that. So I would tell the president, start a withdrawal of military forces. At the same time, try to get a regional coalition of people from the region. Get in bed with our erstwhile enemies if we have to. It's their problem. It really is. Iran has a vested interest in the well-being of Iraq, and Saudi Arabia has the same. Jordan and even Israel has a vested interest in regional stability. Egypt, let's get the leadership in the region in there to help solve the regional problem. And let us sit outside and use our might economically and militarily, psychologically, to keep the playing field even while they attempt to do something for Iraq. And we need to provide equipment. We don't need to provide troops. We need to provide equipment and training. But we can do that here. So let's establish institutes for training that will bring Iraqi people in here. Let's tie them to us economically, legitimately, and begin to support that nation that way. But continually to send troops into a combat situation and surge it. We've been down that road before. That is a similarity to Vietnam. And that's one thing when we put together Desert Storm. One of the things that we said right up front was there will be no escalation. We did that once before. We're not going to do that again. So let's not go into a combat situation until you have adequate combat power in the region to finish the job. And once you start the combat, then finish it quickly. Use all the power that you need to do to finish it. There is no such thing as a kinder, gentler war. And fighting a slow war is an awful lot like going and getting your flu shot and having the nurse put the needle in slowly so it won't hurt. You don't want to do that. You use as much combat power as you need to decisively determine a victor. And then you go from that particular point on.
One of my former students joined the Air Force, and he went to Iraq as an air police officer. And I saw him a while back, and I asked him, and this kid is as apolitical as this table. Not a Republican, not a Democrat, not a liberal, not a conservative, just politics is just meaningless to him. And I asked him, we were just chatting briefly about his experience, and he said that he was guarding a group of Iraqi prisoners. I don't know who they were, but they were prisoners. And they had some Iraqi guards helping them. And so about the time he got his orders to come home, he was going to be rotated out, he said, he asked one of these Iraqis who he knew spoke English, he said, well, what are you going to do when we leave? And he said, the man looked at him and said, I'm going to go home and get my AK-47 and kill all these people.
Yeah.
Is there a fear of a bloodbath?
Oh,
When
yeah.
the British pulled out of India between the Hindus
Sure.
and the Muslims there, is that a great fear of ours?
Absolutely. No doubt about it. And it certainly will happen. That's one thing the surge has done. That has provided more troops to provide more one-on-one, if you will, interface between neighborhoods. So it's calmed down because the troops are there.
But when they leave,
when they leave, you won't have that deterrent force there or that deterrent capability there, and the bad guys are going to come back out and start shooting again.
so we would have to be prepared for this to continue to work, to stay in Iraq for
A long time. A long, long time. My estimate when it first came back out, and my estimate was we'd be in Iraq for at least 20 years.
Would the American public stand for that?
No. And what you're seeing now in a lot of the election rhetoric and campaign rhetoric is just that. Now, with all due respect to the candidates who are wonderful, good American people, but there is a difference between being in office and being a candidate for office.
I think all politicians, if they were honest, would admit that.
Yeah, and one of those differences is that you don't really have all the information that you need to make sound judgments. So the day that Barry Craig becomes elected president, the next morning, somebody's going to show up at your front door and say, "Okay, Mr. President-elect, let me give you a briefing now on what the world really looks like. Let me tell you about all the behind-the-scenes negotiations. Let me tell you about all the rhetoric that's been for public consumption only, what the real world looks like. And it may not look a lot like you campaigned on it looking, So now you go, oh my God, what am I going to do about this campaign, the promise that I made to get the troops out by Thursday afternoon late? Whoa, I can't do that." And sometimes politicians find themselves in that position. And so, it's just kind of the nature of our system, the way things are, the way things have evolved. But
So whoever becomes president is going to have a tough road to hoe over Iraq.
well, it's my view, and I'm not a political scientist. You need to ask some of the political science guys here, and yourself included in that. But it's my view that most presidents spend their first term handling issues that they inherited from the previous president.
Sure.
So that automatically gives you a 4-year cycle there that you're gonna go through the "what are we doing now, Charlie?" Group with your staff. And I think that's the incoming president is likely to not be any different from anyone else in that situation. So it's not going to be an easy problem, and there are no easy solutions. The American public, as a public, has simple solutions to complex problems. And back during we had the first gasoline shortage. Back in the late 70s, early 80s. And the average guy on the street, his solution to that was, let's send the 82nd Airborne over there and make them carry it back in 5-gallon cans. And the very last thing that we in the military wanted at that time was something that could conceivably lead to a confrontation with the Soviet Union. Because in the late 1970s, we were still recovering from Vietnam, and the last thing we needed at that point in time was a war of any kind or any size. And but yet, the American public wants it. When Bobby finishes a long, hard week's work and comes back home, climbs in that Camaro to go out on the town on Friday night, and not only is there not any cheap gas, there's not any gas, period. Then Bobby starts raising Cain with the politicians. And the politicians are the ones that wage war. We were the guys who implement their decision, and they respond to the will of the people.
That brings up an interesting point about politicians. There are very few sons and daughters of politicians in Iraq. Does that trouble you?
No, not really.
Well, what made me think of it, I was watching that wonderful Ken Burns program on KET on World War II, which is fantastic.
It is great.
I was watching it the other night. My dad was in the South Pacific, and they were doing Guadalcanal. He was at Tarawa, but anyway. And there was Marine Raiders. and the second in command was President Roosevelt's
That's
son.
right. Yeah.
But yet, the president has daughters who are of military age. I did hear that Mitt Romney, his son, said he was serving. A reporter asked him, "Your dad supports the war. Why aren't you there?" He said, "Well, I'm serving my country by driving my dad around in this Winnebago." I mean, as a soldier yourself, does that trouble you that these politicians that?
Not really, quite honestly. The sons and daughters of politicians can do whatever they want. I have one son who just retired, believe it or not, from the Army. With 24 years worth of service, he retired as a major. He had 3 tours in the Middle East, served over there, and twice in Iraq and once during Desert Storm. And I'm very proud of Dave. On the other hand, I have another son who did not go in the military at all. He didn't run away from it. He just was not interested in doing that, and there was no motivation at the time he was eligible to do that. So he went into private industry. I'm equally proud of him. I have 2 daughters. Neither one of them, my oldest daughter did in fact take ROTC in college, but as having served or having an obligation to serve has long since passed. So and that doesn't really bother me. But I do think sometimes that it might not be a bad idea. Next time Congress just jumps on a war bandwagon, let's develop a program that would allow them to go handle it for the first 30 days. And then we'll check with them and say, okay, you guys, if you really still feel like we need to be there, we'll come over and bail you out and take your place.
Send them in first.
Yeah, but you guys go do it first. See how you like this thing. And I don't know. I've had a share of being shot at, and I don't really know of anybody who in the middle of a firefight said, "Gee, this is fun and worthwhile," and I'm really glad to be here. It just is kind of an alien thought, quite honestly, to old Snuffy. And if you go and watch Ken Burns' special, or if you talk to some guys who've been down in the trenches, you'll talk about all the good stuff. God does really great work, and he takes all the bad, horrible, really nasty, vicious things away from your mind. And you don't remember those. You remember your buddies and the friends and the successes and all. But in the middle of a firefight is not a time to say, "Gee, I really think this is great. Mm-hmm. I'm glad I'm over here." Mm-hmm. I don't want to go home. Let me tell you, I can tell you right now, I would have gone home anytime. Then when that first bullet whips past your ear and you hear that thing go pop as it slides by, I really don't want to be there anymore. I don't know too many people who do. So I think Robert E. Lee was the man who said, "It is good that war is terrible, otherwise we might tend to use it too much." Mm-hmm. And I think maybe we need to stop and think about that a little bit. Mm-hmm. Let's not be so quick to jump in with our military forces. But if we do, if there's no other way around it, if our judgment is such that that's the only thing left for us to do, then do it with everything you've got. Don't pussyfoot around with it. Mm-hmm. Don't go for a kinder, gentler, nicer, more precise and politically correct war. Such a beast does not exist, and it's folly to search for
mm-hmm. it. The last time you were on campus, you seemed to be skirting around the D word, draft. Mm-hmm. Do we need to bring back the draft in your view?
In my view, yes. I think we do.
You're not running for office, are you? Obviously, no. I was going to say,
no, because anybody who said that and ran for office would be a kiss of
absolutely,
death.
It would be totally.
Yeah.
Why do you think that? Because you hear all the talk about the modern professional army and all this, but you think we should go back to the days of the citizen soldier?
Mm-hmm, I do, and for this reason, I love history. And when you stop and look at it at a historical site, when you don't have a draft, when you have a, quote, professional, all-volunteer army, it takes away the concept of service. The military no longer becomes a crusade. It no longer becomes an obligation with meaning to the individual. It becomes a job. I know a lot of people who go in the military because they can't get a job and they want something to do to make the car payments with, or whatever it might be. And that's all well and good, but when we as a nation rely on a purely volunteer professional army, we're in essence, as a nation, abrogating our responsibility to defend our own way of life. And that means that you're hiring mercenaries. It doesn't make any difference whether or not your mercenary comes from Belgium or whether or not he comes from Brookport. A mercenary is a mercenary with all the loyalty and all the stick-to-itiveness and all the devotion of any other mercenary. And I've fought with mercenaries and beside them, but they're great people in many cases, but they're there for the buck. And the motivation for truth, justice, and the American way is not there to the degree that we've had it in the past. But what really frightens me about it, Barry, is this. I cannot find, as a student of history, as an amateur historian, if you will, I can't find an instance of any single civilization that survived for very long after it got to the point of using mercenaries to defend itself and established a policy of paying the Dane Guild to its enemies. I cannot find anyone who survived much after they began doing
Well,
that.
certainly if you watch the Ken Burns program, that was a citizen army that defeated the Nazis and the Japanese.
And
in
you
World
know,
War II.
a few years back, I had an opportunity to sit down with two Russian generals. And these old boys were tough old guys, and they had been through the purge years, and they were in their 80s, you know.
Wow.
I mean, these guys had been through it all, including World War II. And one of the things that they were very quick to tell me was that they lost more people in the Battle of Stalingrad than we lost before we got into the war than we lost during all of the war in both theaters, you know. And World War II to the Soviet Union and to the Russians, I'm sure the same. It was an incredibly traumatic event.
What, more than 20 million killed at least?
Yeah. And you know, they can still hear the sounds of those Panzer tanks rolling toward Moscow. And but when they assessed, when my counterpart in the Kremlin as a war planner did his assessment of America's military might, he didn't look at what we had forward deployed in Europe or what we could deploy from Fort whatever in the United States. What he looked at in terms of America's capability is what we did in World War II. And what we did in World War II is we started essentially from a standing start. You know, happy days are here again, the Depression's over. Yeah, we know there's something going on in Europe, but that's somebody else's problem right now. The Ken Burns early program. And all of a sudden we were attacked by an enemy that was perceived as a sneak attack on Sunday, for heaven's sakes. You know, and the American people just got mad. You know, and everybody went to war. And again, the Ken Burns thing is pointing this out nicely.
Sure.
I was a little kid, and you probably weren't even born at the time.
Not till 1949 for me.
But I was 6 years old, and I remember President Roosevelt's declaration. I remember going out and looking for Japanese airplanes when they came on to talk about the attack on. I thought Pearl Harbor was in Joppa or someplace. You know. So you know, we didn't have any idea as little children what it was all about. But looking back on it, it was an event that every American, for the most part, vast majority, impacted upon them in one way or the other. And in 4 short years, now keep in mind 4 years, we've been in Iraq longer than we were in World War II. In 4 short years with American resolve, we turned the economy around from a standing start. We built an army that was second to none of pure amateurs. You know, pure amateurs. Our army at the start of World War II was smaller than that of Romania.
I heard that. Oh, yeah, on the Ken Burns thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and we turned our production lines, our economy. We went onto a war footing, and in 4 short years, we did what we said a minute ago: was we held one enemy in place soundly defeated another, learned while we were doing, equipped not only our own army but those of our allies. And then when that first enemy was defeated, we turned around, defeated the other enemy, having held them in place with a technology that the world has never seen before, then turned around and rebuilt both of them economically and politically into two of our strongest allies today. You know, hey, that's what the Russians saw when they looked at America in terms of American resolve. And I would suggest to you that that perception probably what kept us at peace from 1945 all the way up through.
What they call it, mutually assured destruction.
Mutually
right.
assured destruction, because we knew that they would, we would both destroy each other's.
That's an interesting perspective you just brought. That we've been in Iraq longer than World War II.
We have.
And that's the sort of thing. It's sort of like, oh yeah, I didn't realize that. I don't think people realize that.
Maybe we should.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like getting that shot again.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're going to go fight a war, go fight a war. Get it over with. George Patton, throughout his military career, repeatedly, over and over and over again, I guess it impacted on me and some others that was really the thing to do. To fight a war, you fight it with everything you've got. Get it over with. It's much more merciful. It's better on everybody, your enemy as well as yourself. Mm-hmm. You know, don't pussyfoot around in it, and don't drag it on and drag it on and drag it on. If you're not going to do that, then for God's sakes, don't go in there in the first place. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, we did that back to Vietnam. We did that largely. Well, one of the things that we put together when we did Desert Storm was those of us who were involved, and there weren't that many of us at the start of this thing. And we just got a big piece of butcher paper and said, this is what we're going to do and this is what we're not going to do. And one of the things that we said we're not going to do is that we are not going to go for this escalation business. You know, and once we start, we're going to start. The other thing we said was that we want definitive goals. We want to know what our objective is. You know,
isn't there 9 principles of warfare? I remember reading about this. And one of them is objective, that before you start any war, you'd better have a clear objective. So what is our objective in Iraq?
Beats me. That's my problem, is I don't see that anybody did that. We said, okay, here's our objectives. This is, and I said this was at a fairly high level in the government. You know, you got a bunch of officers who are tasked with doing this, and we're going to go do it. But we're not going to try not to make the same mistakes we had in Vietnam, in which we were, for example, told to go in there and do something. And it was, I want you guys to go in there and do something. I don't know what it is I want you to do, but I'll know it when I see it, and this isn't it, so you guys keep trying something else. And we did this and did this and did this and did this. The only thing we really did was we spun around because we didn't have any direction. We didn't have any way to judge how well we were doing or how poorly we were doing. Somebody was talking the other day about the general's comments, you know, and how well you do depends on what your criteria is. And how well you do depends on how closely you're coming to accomplishing your goal. And if you don't have those defined, you don't have any way to judge. So you can say, well, it looks good to me, and the other guy has a different view, and his criteria is different than yours, so he comes back and says, no, you guys are screwing up badly. So, you know, it's very, very important to have objectives. Our objectives when we went into Desert Storm was, number one, to restore the kingdom of the rulers, the government, rightful government of Kuwait, to drive Saddam Hussein's forces away from Kuwait and back into Iraq, and to restore regional stability, and to ensure that his military capability was destroyed. Mm-hmm. And less than 100 hours after we fired our first ground shot in anger, those had all been accomplished.
Mm-hmm. Going back to, after the war, there was some criticism, and people asked, why didn't we go all the way to Baghdad and knock this guy off?
Because we didn't have written on that piece of butcher paper, kill Saddam Hussein. And the reason we didn't say kill Saddam Hussein was actually several reasons. Number one, if Saddam Hussein had been killed, then he would have been replaced by someone who could conceivably have been worse than he was. And secondly, in that same light, we would very likely have made a martyr out of the man. All right. Secondly, or thirdly, depending on how you look at it, we had, at that particular time, when we attained all the objectives that we had listed, we had 482 casualties. Casualties, not KIA, casualties.
Right.
We knew Saddam Hussein was in Baghdad, and we knew that in order to get him and kill him, we would probably had to have gone into Baghdad. Up until this time, we'd fought our kind of war. Now, we made a little bit of a mistake in the sense that we assumed that there was more resistance to him than there actually was. Mm-hmm. We assumed that once the Iraqi people realized what a terrible disaster this guy had brought upon their country,
they'd overthrow him.
They would overthrow him themselves, and we underestimated his strength in that sense of the word. But we knew also that to go get him, we would have had to have taken a lot of casualties. We would have no longer fought a open, fast-moving desert type of warfare in which our assets could have been capitalized. We would have been fighting urban warfare in a town controlled by the enemy, in a type of urban warfare that we were not that familiar with and didn't want to get familiar with. And we knew that the death toll for us and the destruction toll would have been immense on us, and it would have been horrible on the Iraqis. Mm-hmm. And so, it just didn't seem that would be quite worth it. The other reason was that Saddam Hussein in power in a Saddam-controlled Iraq kept a check on Iran.
Right.
The other reason was that the coalition was beginning to be a little shaky, our coalition. And we were having a terrible time keeping Israel out of the war. And we knew that if Israel got into the war, that would have totally destroyed the coalition. Mm-hmm. We didn't want to see that happen. We didn't want to see the United States presence there. At that time, we didn't want to see the United States have to go it alone without the support of a regional coalition. So for all of those factors, we said it's time to quit. We were also being criticized because of the destruction that we wrought on Saddam's forces as they retreated out of Basra. And you may recall it was a turkey shoot.
Oh yeah, the pictures of the columns.
And the folks were beginning to moan and groan that we were using too much violence, too much force, which to me is a little silly. But be that as it may, mm-hmm. Politicians respond to that thing, and so we were taking some heat for being too mean and too nasty and too tough.
A minute ago, you mentioned Iran,
mm-hmm.
and that in a talk you were talking on campus here the other day in your talk, you're talking about devils around the world, and yeah. That was one that got mentioned was Iran.
Yeah.
So what's the situation in Iran? That they're over here on the edge, and what's going on? What should we do about Iran?
Well, Iran, I suspect that Iran is one of those situations where much is said for public consumption, and much is done behind the scenes that's not particularly for public consumption. Mm-hmm. So Iran was for a long time a strong ally of the United States.
With the Shah, right.
With the Shah.
Sure.
Iran, the Iranian people tend to have a strong presence here in this country.
Oh, they do. When I was in college in the 60s, there were a lot of Iranian students.
Yeah, and so, things may not be quite as bad with Iran as they appear. No, the Iranian president just, made a complete and total fool of himself in Columbia University and at the United Nations. But keep in mind, this man doesn't really have much power. The people who run Iran are the Ayatollahs. Mm-hmm. Not the secular presidents. I mean, so he can rant and rave and holler and yell and scream and shout all he wants to. Probably not a whole lot. Iran, I would think, offers could bring a good bit to the table in terms of regional stability if it chose to do so.
Isn't it the strongest power militarily and economically in the Middle East?
Militarily, not necessarily economically.
Yeah, but militarily it is.
Saudi Arabia probably is economically the biggest,
sure.
the most powerful force there.
Right.
And I spent almost 5 years in Saudi Arabia as a senior advisor to the Crown Prince after Desert Storm. And that's an interesting experience in and of itself. But you get a wonderful opportunity in this case to actually get inside that culture. And it's a different culture, and you have to look at the world through different eyes. And we don't do that very well sometimes, you know. We have a kind of a, politically speaking, a kind of a General Bull Moose attitude. If you remember the old character in Little Abner, General Bull Moose, you know, who was an American industrialist and said if it's good for Bull Moose, it's good for the country. And
right.
Well, that's sometimes the way we do these things. I remember a high-level American in the Department of State who came to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia when I was there, and he complained instantly because the street signs were all in Arabic. And he had a hard time finding his way around. Well, you know, how many street signs do you find in Washington, D.C. that are not written in English?
Right.
You know, but that sometimes is just our approach to these things.
You know, it kind of reminds me of the book, Francis Fitzgerald's book, Fire in the Lake. Wasn't that one of her arguments, that we don't know the culture? When you go into a country and you don't understand at all the culture of Vietnam or Southeast Asia in this case. But you're right. I think that's our attitude. We're just going to force our way in.
Well, I am insulting you no end if we were in Saudi Arabia and you were a Saudi.
Right.
I'm just insulting you no end because the bottom of my shoe is pointing at you. And that is an incredible insult. That is worse than giving you the bird 3 or 4 times. I mean, that is just a terrible insult. You know, we've been sitting here doing this simply by virtue of who we are, where we are, and the way we're positioned. But if I was in Saudi Arabia, I would be in big trouble for doing that. So you have to learn these things.
There are pitfalls.
Yeah, you have to learn the pitfalls. You don't know about it. You go wandering through, you know. So, you know, we don't do that. We simply do not. In Vietnam, in the early years, somebody got a great idea that one reason why they were having so many problems and the guerrillas were having so much success was that villages were isolated. So they went into this particular area in Vietnam and decided that what they would do is they would build roads and connect villages. And then they would be able to have commerce and communications and what have you with one another. Things would be better. Okay, so they neglected to find out that in that particular section with those particular people, the villages were symbolically laid out. And they were symbolically laid out in the form of animals. So one village, which was essentially an oblong thing, was a turtle. Or an oval thing was a turtle. Another village down here, which was long and slender, was a snake. You know, well, if you take a road and bisect the two and you cut the head off the snake, what happens to the snake? The snake dies. Mm-hmm. So everybody watched the bulldozers as they made the road, and then all the villagers said, well, our village is dead, let's go. And they all left, and nobody knew why.
Wow.
I remember sometimes we think, I remember standing on a tarmac in Vietnam as a lieutenant behind a bunch of guys, politicians, diplomats, and generals, and what have you. Lieutenants don't do much. You just sort of stand there and, you know, kind of shield everybody from wind and rain. But a helicopter had come back in, an ARVN helicopter, a South Vietnamese helicopter had come back in and landed, and in the bottom of the helicopter was a spear. And I remember standing there listening to all these high-ranking guys walking around sort of chuckling to themselves, saying, how can you expect to lose a war against an enemy that throws spears at helicopters? And I remember standing there thinking, no, wait a minute, you guys got it wrong. The question is, how do you expect to win a war against an enemy that will throw spears at a helicopter? And we're right now in the helicopter and spear mode in Iraq. You know, we've got guys who don't have sophisticated weaponry. So what are they doing? They're taking old artillery shells and making IEDs out of them, improvised explosive devices out of them. They're making booby traps. They're blowing stuff up. They're putting bombs in things. They're making do. So that in and of itself indicates an unlevel playing field diplomatically, and it indicates that you got a lot of will. People don't blow themselves up just for the fun of it. They blow themselves up because there's no other choice. And so whenever we look at these things, wherever in the world, we need to realize that there's something deeper, harder, nastier, more ideological, unfair, if you will, that's going on, and we need to dive into it. And maybe it's cultural, maybe it's not. Some of that is cultural, but on the other hand, a lot of it is I just ain't got nothing else to work with. And we need to learn how to deal with that.
How do we do that? Is it in our schools? I mean, what do we do?
I think it's philosophical. It's part of our culture, part of our society ourselves.
Of course, we're a very gadget, gizmo, mechanical-oriented society. All these things, sophisticated weapons, sophisticated everything. Is that part of it? That our in other words, our military reflects our culture in that respect.
Yeah, our military does reflect our culture, which is frightening. Our military ought to be better than our culture. And I have lived long enough and have enough scars here somewhere to have come to the conclusion, too, that anytime you fight a high-tech war, a high-tech force against a low-tech force is going to win every time.
Well, you look at the Soviets in Afghanistan, they had a problem with that. The Israelis have had a problem. These very, very powerful high-tech armies.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember a Soviet advisor when the Soviets were in Afghanistan. I remember a Soviet advisor that fell into the hands of Mujahideen. Mm-hmm. They tied him to a wagon wheel and rolled him down a mountain pass.
Yeah.
You got the message pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. I
was one of the happiest guys in the world when Soviets went into Afghanistan because I knew what was going to happen, or at least I thought I did, and I was very happy about it, and for a lot of different reasons. And basically what I said was, ho, 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 the Russians didn't read our lessons learned in Vietnam.
Right.
Well, right now, I'm sure there's some Russian counterparts sitting over in the Kremlin sitting there saying, ho, 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 the Americans didn't read our lessons learned in Afghanistan.
Right. Right.
So how do we correct that? I don't know. I think we need to maybe refocus the emphasis on history in some of our military institutions. We need to do some revamping of our educational process here in this country. I think we've got people that have absolutely no idea where Myanmar is.
Mm-hmm. And I hate to interrupt. We're out of time.
Oh, shoot. It's fun.
Please come back again.
We'd be happy to.
Outstanding.
It's been great. Sorry I've burned up all your tape.
Oh, listen. Glad you did it. I'm Barry Craig. My guest today was Colonel Don Askew. Please join us next time. Thanks.